Evan, let's wrap up. Our last person here is Daniel Hale, who is currently, I guess, in prison, correct? And serving, what, 40 something months?
He got 45 months, but ultimately he'll probably only be in prison for, let's say, 18 of those months. So that's good, just because of good time credit. I think he's going to be in a substance abuse program, which can take off a year of time that you're incarcerated. But still, that's 45 months too many for somebody who is a Afghanistan war veteran who was involved in the drone program, who released these drone papers to Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept. And it exposed that in things like in a 5-month span of time, 90% of the people being killed were civilians, and they weren't terrorists or alleged terrorism suspects at all. We have lots of information that he disclosed related to the watch list, the way that people get put on the watch list. His document was used to try and get people who are on the no-fly list off of the no-fly list. With some success, people were able to remove their names. It's a big deal. But then, in addition, he's showing in his documents that the drone strikes that are being launched are just not killing the people that our government is claiming. And the standard that's being used is not reflected in what President Barack Obama was telling us. You have President Barack Obama saying that the people who are being targeted pose an imminent threat to the United States. But in fact, in his unit, there's a much looser standard, which is if they pose any threat to any interest of the United States, then, or if they get in the way of any interest of the United States, then they could be targets of the U.S. military, which is much different than whether they pose a threat to you or me or some other part of the United States. So that's a lie. And he exposed a lot of this. He challenged this. He gave quite a moving speech in court. He's quite an admirable whistleblower, in my opinion, but he's being put in prison for the disclosure of these documents. And he's actually been kept in limbo. I don't know if he's made it to the federal prison where he'll be held, but he was in a transfer facility with like 100 or so other men for at least a month and just waiting to be put where he's going to be held, which is just very gross to me. It's another part of the way we wage war on our whistleblowers, and another example of how these cases don't end when somebody pleads guilty and is sentenced to prison. I've done a lot of work following the way whistleblowers get treated in these prisons, whether we're talking about him or CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou did a time in prison. And recently we got to see hear from Terry Albury, who is an FBI whistleblower who has a lot of good things to share about FBI religious profiling and the way they go after informants and target people with surveillance. And so it doesn't end because they plead guilty. They go to prison and they go through mistreatment. And that's part of why Julian Assange doesn't want to be extradited to the United States, because he knows about the harsh treatment that lies ahead for whistleblowers. And then now we're using the same law to go after whistleblowers in order to go after journalists who are not who do not cater to the establishment narratives.
So, Kevin, one of the things about Daniel's story that confused me when I first heard that he got arrested was that he was a national bird. And I remember watching that movie 5 years ago or so, and I was really confused as to how he was just got arrested and how he goes through, I guess, a good chunk of the Obama administration and Trump administration without being targeted at all, and then he ends up getting arrested at the end of the Trump administration, prosecuted, and then sentenced finally under Biden. So I mean, why did they leave? Do we have any idea why they left him alone for so long and why they suddenly just snatched him up?
Yeah, it's because of the change in policy in the Trump administration to accelerate and ramp up the number of leak prosecutions that were pursued. And so there's actually a document that was uncovered by his defense when they were putting together their case. They were planning to go to trial initially, but a lot of times you end up deciding not to go to trial because you can't put on a public interest defense in court and say why you released the documents. So he did plead guilty to a charge, and they didn't need to necessarily use this document, but they found that there were higher ranking officials in the Justice Department that did not want to bring charges against Daniel Hale, that cautioned against doing so in the National Security Division. And so then the case just sat there, and it wasn't closed, but it was there, and he had this cloud hanging over him. But as you're saying, it wasn't until 2019, which is 4 or 5 years later, that we had an indictment issued. And actually, the indictment comes almost around the same time that Julian Assange is indicted, or the indictment against him is released to the public. Just a month later, that's when Daniel Hale was indicted. And so it's part of this policy that the Trump administration had to go after people like Julian Assange and Daniel Hale. And I don't even know exactly why Obama, who has this reputation of being involved in the war on whistleblowers, didn't want to charge Daniel Hale, or why people would have protected him from another political case like this one. However, I will say, and this is my theory, there were a lot of us that called him things like President Kill List or the drone warrior in chief. And perhaps he didn't want to have this as part of his legacy, that Daniel Hale was prosecuted under his watch. So it just sat there, and for the same reasons they wouldn't go after Assange, there might have been very similar reasons for not going after Daniel Hale.